I'm Seth Lamar, one of 5 Associate Directors of Housing Operation with Common Ground, and as Arden mentioned, I oversee 4 of our 11 permanent supportive housing sites, and thank you very much for being here today. So what I hope to accomplish today is a brief overview of Common Ground, our rent administration philosophy, and the distinct roles of the property manager and the social service provider, who are all on site. Common Ground was founded in 1991. We own about 11 properties and we manage 2, 386 units of transitional housing, and we conduct street outreach in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens. Our partners are, Center for Urban Community Services, which is CUCS, the Actors Fund, Good Shepherd, Bronx Works, and The Door. And they are all located on site and partner with us to provide services to the tenants. We have a robust staff, probably, and also 24-hour contracted security, and all of our rent administrators are on site. The population is comprised of a mix of formerly homeless tenants and low-income tenants. I say it's probably about 60% formerly homeless. All of the tenants have a permanent lease. I think that's what distinguishes a little bit from scatter sites, because they do not they're not the leaseholder. The tenants are not the leaseholder. They must pay rent and have some form of income. For our low-income populations, they tend to come in at a set rate, and their income, their renewal increase upon renewal. Formerly homeless pay 30% of their income, and either they have a PA allowance or a PA shelter allowance. We deal with a number of subsidies, including Section 8 vouchers, both project-based and tenant-based, PRAC, OMH funding, DOHMH subsidies, and HASA. For example, our flagship property, which is the Times Square, some of you may know it, it's at 43rd Street. We have 650 units of supportive housing there, and about 350 of those tenants have individual tenant-based vouchers. So I think you can understand around in income recertification time what kind of job the rent administrator has there.
I've been part of that recertification. It's good times.
Yes, right. And we also, to a limited degree, deal with SCRE, which is a senior-based subsidy, and DRE, which is a disability-based subsidy. And we engage in a consistent sort of recurring rent collection process for everyone. So now I'll go through some of the distinct roles. As the property manager, we generate leases, we distribute the monthly rent bills, we collect the rent, we enter into payment plans, we issue late letters, we institute the court process, and we also facilitate monthly arrears meetings with the service providers and other providers where necessary. As for social services, they complement that process by working to secure entitlements for clients, engaging in budgeting and money management skills. They describe the consequences of not paying rent to the tenant and sort of help them make informed decisions, and provide support and understanding the legal process should we have to engage in that process. As Arden mentioned, the key to successful collaboration in this way is constant communication. So we do have meetings at all levels. There's constant communication between the rent administrator and the case workers from the service providers. We CC the service provider on all of the documents. We provide pertinent information to all of the social service staff. We do share lease expiration listings, arrears report, all of the documents that we keep to sort of help us keep track of what we're doing with regard to rent administration. There's also high-level analysis to determine overall rent collection, and I'll speak a little bit on that later. We also, now having said that, we also use creative methods to collect rent. We do internal payment plans, which are usually flexible and often consider the tenant's other obligations, including the non-traditional obligations. So I don't think that I need to go into those when we think about who's a legitimate creditor and who's not. Let's say we have payment plans that are usually the outcome. Payment plans are also usually the outcome of legal action. I think we have to be prepared to sort of negotiate in that process because depending on the philosophy of the judge, sometimes their payment plans can extend over very long periods of time with very low payments, and meanwhile, tenants tend to veer from that, so they start to accumulate more arrears. And I think that there are also cases where we even modify the court-stipulated payment plans, all in an effort to help the tenant sort of get back on track and out of arrears. While I don't oversee any of the scatter site, I think I have some colleagues in here that do. I did want to briefly mention that their rent collection process is slightly different. Our finance department tends to send the rent bills to the staff there, the operations manager and the director, whereas in our permanent sites, the rent statements go directly to the tenants. The operations manager in the scatter site is hugely involved in bill review or accuracy, for accuracy in all aspects of tenant collection. They use a multiple sort of level case management approach, sort of similar to the HASA levels, to sort of address recurring rent arrear issues. The follow-up is primarily handled by the operations manager, so given that they do all of it in one place, I think the operations manager has a huge job. So what I just wanted to mention this because what we're looking at doing is bringing some of the best practices that we've learned from rent administration in the permanent supportive housing sites to the scatter site rent collection process. Okay, with regard to sort of consistent sort of recurring processes, we, of course, we engage in the no-pay process. That starts with the rent demand, and that takes you through the legal process should we choose to go there. We always, though, provide an opportunity for the tenant to repay arrears and return to good status. We do late letters on the same day to all tenants. However, if they don't respond to the late letters, follow up with tenants with a 5-day demand, which is usually the first step in the legal process, is varied and very individual depending on the level of engagement with the tenant. Do I keep doing this? Okay. And so what we do is that we use court as a tool and not simply for eviction. For instance, Common Ground has an internal goal where we want to maintain a less than 1% eviction rate. So sometimes court is used to get stipulations. It's also used to get access to guardianships. It also adds a sense of legitimacy to the process because if you have someone who's been a tenant in permanent supportive housing for a long time and we tend to be lenient with them in terms of how they pay, they start to think, you do supportive housing, you're in the business of preventing homelessness, you're never going to evict me. So I think the court process is a good way to bring some legitimacy to when we say, no, you really do have to pay this time. We have gone above and beyond. You really do have to pay. So with regard to, as I mentioned, internal processes, we do payment plans, and they are usually creative and varied and based on the tenant's budget. We do small balance letters. We do meetings at all levels of management weekly. We do late letters. We do 5-day demands. We connect with the representative payee if we need to. With regard to external, there's a notice of petition. That's usually after when we've engaged in the legal process and the tenant receives something in the mail saying that you have a court date and that you need to show up to court. Again, an outcome of the legal process could be stipulations, one-shot deals, adult protective services, different forms of guardianship, or a chronic no-pay. And I should say that I don't know how many of you have heard of a chronic no-pay, but that's actually not a no-pay case. It's actually a holdover case because that is considered behavioral. But they are very, very, very hard to bring because the tenant also has to have had at least 5 or more no-pay cases before you can enter to a chronic no-pay. So we rarely do those. So as I end here, I wanted to mention, we do have internal metrics at Common Ground that sort of help us keep track of how we're doing across buildings with regard to rent collection. And 3 examples of that. One is the arrears report. That we distribute on a monthly basis, and that gives us an idea of how tenants are doing with regard to rent payment every month. A second is a management index, and actually I have a colleague here in the audience who is sort of charged with generating that report. And what that does is that it ranks tenants in 5 different areas, one of which is rent payment, and with a 5 being an outstanding rent payment history and a 1 being in need of additional support. And lastly, there's something we call the dashboard, which really looks at the metrics and looks at rent collection, 6-month averages across buildings, so we can look at trends and see how one building is doing compared to another. And it really helps us stay abreast of what's happening with regard to rent collection. The interesting thing about that, as Arden mentioned earlier, because we have to be so creative and we do want to maintain an above 95% rent collection rate, sometimes when we tend to dip below that, we have other departments that look at these tools, and so you need to be in a position to have documentation to support why your rent collection rate has fallen below, because all of these different avenues and roads that we take to help tenants get on track, sometimes rent collection rates and arrears are higher and rent collection is lower.